The musical film is a film genre in which songs sung by the characters are interwoven into the narrative, sometimes accompanied by dancing. The songs usually advance the plot or develop the film's characters, though in some cases they serve merely as breaks in the storyline, often as elaborate production numbers. The musical film was a natural development of the stage musical after the emergence of sound film technology. Typically, the biggest difference between film and stage musicals is the use of lavish background scenery and locations that would be impractical in a theater. Musical films characteristically contain elements reminiscent of theater. Performers often treat their song and dance numbers as if there is a live audience watching. In a sense, the viewer becomes the diegetic audience, as the performer looks directly into the camera and performs to it. Musical films in the Western world. The classical sound era. The 1930s through the early 1950s are considered to be the golden age of the musical film, when the genre's popularity was at its highest in the Western world. The first musical short films were made by Lee De Forest in 1923-24. Beginning in 1926, thousands of Vitaphone shorts were made, many featuring bands, vocalists and dancers. The earliest feature-length films with synchronized sound had only a soundtrack of music and occasional sound effects that played while the actors portrayed their characters just as they did in silent films, without audible dialogue. The Jazz Singer, released in 1927 by Warner Brothers, was the first to include an audio track including non-diegetic music and diegetic music, but it had only a short sequence of spoken dialogue. This feature-length film was also a musical, featuring Al Jolson singing Dirty Hands, Dirty Face, Toot, Toot, Tootsie, Blue Skies, and My Mammy. Historian Scott E. Mann wrote, as the film ended and applause grew with the house lights, Sam Goldwyn's wife Frances looked around at the celebrities in the crowd. She saw terror in all their faces, she said, as if they knew that the game they had been playing for years was finally over. Still, only isolated sequences featured live sound. Most of the film had only a synchronous musical score. In 1928, Warner Brothers followed this up with another Jolson part talkie, The Singing Fool, which was a blockbuster hit. Theaters scrambled to install the new sound equipment and to hire Broadway composers to write musicals for the screen. The first all-talking feature, Lights of New York, included a musical sequence in a nightclub. The enthusiasm of audiences was so great that in less than a year all the major studios were making sound pictures exclusively. The Broadway melody had a showbiz plot about two sisters competing for a charming song and dance man. Advertised by MGM as the first all-talking, all-singing, all-dancing feature film, it was a hit and won the Academy Award for Best Picture for 1929. There was a rush by the studios to hire talent from the stage to star in lavishly filmed versions of Broadway hits. The Love Parade starred Maurice Chevalier and newcomer Jeanette MacDonald, written by Broadway veteran Guy Bolton. Warner Brothers produced the first screen operetta, The Desert Song, in 1929. They spared no expense and photographed a large percentage of the film in Technicolor. This was followed by the first all-color, all-talking musical feature which was entitled On With the Show. The most popular film of 1929 was the second all-color, all-talking feature which was entitled Gold Diggers of Broadway. This film broke all box office records and remained the highest-grossing film ever produced until 1939. Suddenly the market became flooded with musicals, revues and operettas. The following all-color musicals were produced in 1929 and 1930 alone: The Show of Shows, Sally, The Vagabond King, Follow Through, Bright Lights, Golden Dawn, Hold Everything, The Rogue Song, Song of the Flame, Song of the West, Sweet Kitty Bellairs, Under a Texas Moon, Bride of the Regiment, Whoopee. King of Jazz, Viennese Nights, Kiss Me Again. In addition, there were scores of musical features released with color sequences. Hollywood released more than 100 musical films in 1930, but only 14 in 1931. By late 1930, audiences had been oversaturated with musicals and studios were forced to cut the music from films that were then being released. For example, Life of the Party was originally produced as an all-color, all-talking musical comedy. Before it was released, however, the songs were cut out. The same thing happened to 50 Million Frenchmen and Manhattan Parade, both of which had been filmed entirely in Technicolor. Marlene Dietrich sang songs successfully in her films, and Rodgers and Hart wrote a few well-received films, but even their popularity waned by 1932. The public had quickly come to associate color with musicals, and thus the decline in their popularity also resulted in a decline in color productions. Busby Berkeley, the taste in musicals revived again in 1933 when director Busby Berkeley began to enhance the traditional dance number with ideas drawn from the drill precision he had experienced as a soldier during World War I. In films such as 42nd Street and Gold Diggers of 1933, Berkeley choreographed a number of films in his unique style. Berkeley's numbers typically begin on a stage but gradually transcend the limitations of theatrical space. His ingenious routines, involving human bodies forming patterns like a kaleidoscope, could never fit onto a real stage, and the intended perspective is viewing from straight above. Musical stars such as Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers were among the most popular and highly respected personalities in Hollywood during the classical era. The Fred and Ginger pairing was particularly successful, resulting in a number of classic films, such as Top Hat, Swing Time and Shall We Dance. Many dramatic actors gladly participated in musicals as a way to break away from their typecasting. For instance, the multi-talented James Cagney had originally risen to fame as a stage singer and dancer, but his repeated casting in tough guy roles and mob films gave him few chances to display these talents. Cagney's Oscar-winning role in Yankee Doodle Dandy allowed him to sing and dance, and he considered it to be one of his finest moments. Many comedies included their own musical numbers. The Marx Brothers films included a musical number in nearly every film, allowing the brothers to highlight their musical talents. Their final film, entitled Love Happy, featured Vera Ellen, considered to be the best dancer among her colleagues and professionals in the half-century. The Freed unit, during the late 1940s and into the early 1950s, a production unit at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer headed by Arthur Freed, made the transition from old-fashioned musical films, whose formula had become repetitive, to something new. In 1939, Freed was hired as associate producer for the film Babes in Arms. Starting in 1944 with Meet Me in St. Louis, the Freed unit worked somewhat independently of its own studio to produce some of the most popular and well-known examples of the genre. The products of this unit include Easter Parade, On the Town, An American in Paris, Singin' in the Rain and The Bandwagon. This era saw musical stars become household names, including Judy Garland, Gene Kelly, Ann Miller, Donald O'Connor, Sid Caris, Mickey Rooney, Vera Ellen, Jane Powell, Howard Keel, and Katherine Grayson. Fred Astaire was also coaxed out of retirement for Easter Parade and made a permanent comeback. The post-classical era. In the 1960s, 1970s and continuing up to today, the musical film became less of a bankable genre that could be relied upon for surefire hits. Audiences for them lessened and fewer musical films were produced as the genre became less mainstream and more specialized. The 1960s musical. In the 1960s, the success of the films West Side Story, The Music Man, My Fair Lady, Mary Poppins, The Sound of Music, Thoroughly Modern Millie, Oliver, and Funny Girl suggested that the traditional musical was in good health. However, popular musical tastes were being heavily affected by rock and roll and the freedom and youth associated with it, and indeed Elvis Presley made a few films that have been equated with the old musicals in terms of form. Most of the musical films of the 1950s and 1960s, such as Oklahoma and The Sound of Music, were straightforward adaptations or restagings of successful stage productions. The most successful musical of the 1960s created specifically for film was Mary Poppins, one of Disney's biggest hits. Despite the success of these musicals, Hollywood also produced a series of musical flops in the late 1960s and early 1970s which appeared to seriously misjudge public taste. The commercially and/or critically unsuccessful films included Camelot, Finian's Rainbow, Hello Dolly, Sweet Charity, Dr. Dolittle, Star, Darling Lili, Goodbye, Mr. Chips, Paint Your Wagon, Song of Norway Ontario A Clear Day You Can See Forever, Man of La Mancha, Lost Horizon and Mame. Collectively and individually these failures crippled several of the major studios. 1970s. In the 1970s, film culture and the changing demographics of filmgoers placed greater emphasis on gritty realism, while the pure entertainment and theatricality of classical-era Hollywood musicals was seen as old-fashioned. Changing cultural mores and the abandonment of the Hays Code in 1968 also contributed to changing tastes in film audiences. The 1973 film of Andrew Lloyd Webber and Tim Rice's Jesus Christ Superstar was met with some criticism by religious groups, but was well received. By the mid-1970s filmmakers avoided the genre in favor of using music by popular rock or pop bands as background music, partly in hope of selling a soundtrack album to fans. The Rocky Horror Picture Show was originally released in 1975 and was a critical failure until it started midnight screenings in the 1980s where it achieved cult status. 1976 saw the release of the low-budget comic musical, The First Nudie Musical, released by Paramount. The 1978 film version of Grease was a smash hit. Its songs were original compositions done in a 1950s pop style. However, the sequel Grease 2 bombed at the box office. Films about performers which incorporated gritty drama and musical numbers interwoven as a diegetic part of the storyline were produced, such as Lady Sings the Blues, All That Jazz, and New York, New York. Some musicals released in the New Hollywood period experimented with the form, such as Bugsy Malone and Listomania. The film musicals that were still being made were financially and critically less successful than in their heyday. They include The Wiz, At Long Last Love, Mame, Man of La Mancha, Lost Horizon, Godspell, Phantom of the Paradise, Funny Lady, A Little Night Music and Hair amongst others. The critical wrath against At Long Last Love in particular was so strong that it was never released on home video. Fiddler on the Roof and Cabaret were more traditional musicals closely adapted from the stage versions and were popular and critical successes. Fantasy musical films Scrooge, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory and Big Knobs and Broomsticks were also released in the 1970s, the latter winning the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects. 1980s to 1990s. By the 1980s, financiers grew increasingly confident in the musical genre, partly buoyed by the relative health of the musical on Broadway and London's West End. Productions of the 1980s and 1990s included The Apple, Xonad, The Blues Brothers, Annie, Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, The Best Little Whorehouse in Texas, Victor Victoria, Footloose, Fast Forward, A Chorus Line, Little Shop of Horrors, Forbidden Zone, Absolute Beginners, Evita and Everyone Says I Love You. However, Can't Stop the Music, starring the Village People, was a calamitous attempt to resurrect the old-style musical and was released to audience indifference in 1980. Little Shop of Horrors was based on an off-Broadway musical adaptation of a 1960 Roger Corman film, a precursor of later film-to-stage-to-film adaptations, including The Producers. Many animated films of the period, predominantly from Disney, included traditional musical numbers. Howard Ashman, Alan Menken and Stephen Schwartz had previous musical theater experience and wrote songs for animated films during this time, supplanting Disney workhorses the Sherman Brothers. Starting with 1989's The Little Mermaid, the Disney Renaissance gave new life to the film musical. Other successful animated musicals included Aladdin, The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Pocahontas from Disney proper, The Nightmare Before Christmas from Disney Division Touchstone Pictures, The Prince of Egypt from DreamWorks, Anastasia from Fox and Don Bluth, and South Park, Bigger, Longer and Uncut from Paramount. 21st Century Musicals. In the 21st century the musical movie was reborn with darker musicals such as Moulin Rouge, Chicago, The Phantom of the Opera, Dreamgirls, Sweeney Todd, The Demon Barber of Fleet Street, Les Miserables, and Into the Woods. All of which won the Golden Globe Award for Best Motion Picture, a Euro musical or comedy in their respective years, with the exceptions of The Phantom of the Opera and Into the Woods, which were only nominated. Chicago was also the first musical since Oliver! to win Best Picture at the Academy Awards. Joshua Oppenheimer's Academy Award-nominated documentary The Act of Killing may be considered a non-fiction musical. One specific musical trend was the rising number of jukebox musicals based on music from various pop-rock artists on the big screen. Examples of jukebox musical films included Mamma Mia, Across the Universe, Sunshine on Leith, Moulin Rouge, Rock of Ages, Pitch Perfect and Walking on Sunshine. Disney also returned to musicals with High School Musical, Enchanted, The Princess and the Frog, Tangled, Winnie the Pooh, The Muppets, Frozen, and Into the Woods. Biopics about music artists were also big in the 21st century. Examples include 8 Mile, Ray, Walk the Line, Notorious, Jersey Boys Love and Mercy, and Straight Outta Compton. Spanish musical films. Spain has a history and tradition of musical films that were made independent of Hollywood influence. The first films arise during the Second Spanish Republic of the 1930s and the advent of sound films. A few zarzuelas were even adapted as screenplays during the silent era. The beginnings of the Spanish musical were focused on romantic Spanish archetypes, Andalusian villages and landscapes, gypsies, bandoleros, and copla and other popular folk songs included in story development. These films had even more box office success than Hollywood premieres in Spain. The first Spanish film stars came from the musical genre, Imperial Argentina, Estrellita Castro, Floria N. Rey and, later, Lola Flores, Sarah Montiel and Carmen Sevilla. The Spanish musicals started to expand and grow. Juvenile stars appear and top the box office. Marisol, Joselito, Pili and Milay and Rocco Diarcal were the major figures of musical films from 60s to 70s. Due to Spanish transition to democracy and rise of movida culture, the musical genre fell into a decadence of production and box office, only saved by Carlos Saura and his flamenco musical films. Indian musical films. An exception to the decline of the musical film is Indian cinema, especially the Bollywood film industry based in Mumbai, where the majority of films have been and still are musicals. The majority of films produced in the Tamil industry based in Chennai, Telugu industry based in Hyderabad, and Malayalam industry are also musicals. Influence on Western films. In the 2000s, Bollywood musicals played an instrumental role in the revival of the musical film genre in the Western world. Baz Luhrmann stated that his successful musical film Moulin Rouge was directly inspired by Bollywood musicals. A film thus pays homage to India, incorporating an Indian-themed play based on the ancient Sanskrit drama The Little Clay Cart and a Bollywood-style dance sequence with a song from the film China Gate. The Guru and the 40-Year-Old Virgin also feature Indian-style song and dance sequences. The Bollywood musical Lagayan was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. Two other Bollywood films Devdas and Rang de Basanti were nominated for the BAFTA Award for Best Film Not in the English Language. And Danny Boyle's Academy Award-winning Slumdog Millionaire also features a Bollywood-style song and dance number during the film's end credits. Soviet musical film under Stalin, unlike the musical films of Hollywood and Bollywood, popularly identified with escapism, the Soviet musical was first and foremost a form of propaganda. Vladimir Lenin said that cinema was the most important of the arts. His successor, Joseph Stalin, also recognized the power of cinema in efficiently spreading Communist Party doctrine. Films were widely popular in the 1920s, but it was foreign cinema that dominated the Soviet film-going market. Films from Germany and the US proved more entertaining than Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein's historical dramas. By the 1930s it was clear that if the Soviet cinema was to compete with its Western counterparts, it would have to give audiences what they wanted, the glamour and fantasy they got from Hollywood. The musical film, which emerged in the 1930s, embodied the ideal combination of entertainment and official ideology. A struggle between laughter for laughter, a unregistered trademark's sake, and entertainment with a clear ideological message would define the golden age of the Soviet musical of the 1930s and 1940s. Then head of the film industry Boris Shumyatsky sought to emulate Hollywood a Euro-unregistered trademark-esque conveyor belt method of production, going so far as to suggest the establishment of a Soviet Hollywood. The Jolly Fellows. In 1930 the esteemed Soviet film director Sergei Eisenstein went to the United States with fellow director Grigory Alexandrov to study Hollywood the Euro-unregistered trademark-esque filmmaking process. The American films greatly impacted Alexandrov, particularly the musicals. He returned in 1932, and in 1934 directed The Jolly Fellows, the first Soviet musical. The film was light on plot and focused more on the comedy and musical numbers. Party officials at first met the film with great hostility. Alexandrov defended his work by arguing the notion of laughter for laughter's sake. Finally, when Alexandrov showed the film to Stalin, the leader decided that musicals were an effective means of spreading propaganda. Messages like the importance of collective labor and rags to riches stories would become the plots of most Soviet musicals. Movies for the millions. The success of The Jolly Fellows ensured a place in Soviet cinema for the musical format, but immediately Shumyatsky set up strict guidelines to make sure the films promoted communist values. Shumyatsky a Euro-unregistered trademark-esque decree a Euro-OE movies for the millions a Euro demanded conventional plots, characters, and montage to successfully portray socialist realism on film. The first successful blend of a social message and entertainment was Alexandrov a Euro-unregistered trademark-esque circus. It starred his wife, Lyubov, as an American circus performer who is to immigrate to the USSR from the US because she has a mixed-race child, whom she had with a black man. Amidst the backdrop of lavish musical productions, she finally finds love and acceptance in the USSR, providing the message that racial tolerance can only be found in the Soviet Union. The influence of Busby Berkeley's choreography on Alexandrov a Euro-unregistered trademark-esque directing can be seen in the musical number leading up to the climax. Another, more obvious reference to Hollywood is the Charlie Chaplin impersonator who provides comic relief throughout the film. 4 million people in Moscow and Leningrad went to see Circus during its first month in theaters. Another of Alexandrov's more popular films was The Bright Path. This was a reworking of the fairy tale Cinderella set in the contemporary Soviet Union. The Cinderella of the story was again Oliver, who by this time was the most popular star in the USSR. It was a fantasy tale, but the moral of the story was that a better life comes from hard work. Whereas in Circus, the musical numbers involve dancing and spectacle, the only type of choreography in Bright Path is the movement of factory machines. The music was limited to all over Euro-unregistered trademark-esque singing. Here, work provided the spectacle. Ivan Pilyev. The other director of musical films was Ivan Pilyev. Unlike Alexandrov, the focus of Piraeva Euro-unregistered trademark-esque films was life on the collective farms. His films, Tractor Drivers, The Swineherd and the Shepherd, and his most famous, Cossacks of the Kibben all starred his wife, Marina Ladinina. Like in Alexandrov a Euro-unregistered trademark-esque Bright Path, the only choreography was the work the characters were doing on film. Even the songs were about the joys of working. Rather than having a specific message for any of his films, Pilyev promoted Stalin's slogan "Life has become better, life has become more joyous." Sometimes this message was in stark contrast with the reality of the time. During the filming of Cossacks of the Kibben, the Soviet Union was going through a post-war famine. In reality, the actors who were singing about a time of prosperity were hungry and malnourished. The films did, however, provide escapism and optimism for the viewing public. Volga Volga. The most popular film of the brief era of Stalinist musicals was Alexandrov's 1938 film Volga Volga. The star, again, was Lyubov, and the film featured singing and dancing, having nothing to do with work. It is the most unusual of its type. The plot surrounds a love story between two individuals who want to play music. They are unrepresentative of Soviet values in that their focus is more on their music than their jobs. The gags poke fun at the local authorities and bureaucracy. There is no glorification of industry since it takes place in a small rural village. Work is not glorified either, since the plot revolves around a group of villagers using their vacation time to go on a trip up the Volga to perform in Moscow. Volga followed the aesthetic principles of socialist realism rather than the ideological tenets. It became Stalin's favorite film and he gave it as a gift to President Roosevelt during WWII. It is another example of one of the films that claimed life is better. Released at the height of Stalin's purges, it provided escapism and a comforting illusion for the public. Lists of musical films. See List of musicals, A to L and List of musicals, M to Z for a list of musicals in alphabetical order. Note that not all of these have been made into films. See List of musical films by year for a list of musical films in chronological order. See List of Bollywood films for a list of Bollywood musical films. See also, AFI's Greatest Movie Musicals, list of films based on stage plays or musicals, revolutionary opera. References. Further reading, Fordin, Hugh. The World of Entertainment, Hollywood's Greatest Musicals, in series, Equinox Book, S. New York, Avon Books, 1976, Cop. 1975. ISBN 0-380-00754-1, McGee, Mark Thomas. The Rock and Roll Movie Encyclopedia of the 1950s. Jefferson, North Carolina. McFarland and Colorado, 1990. 0-89950-500-7, Padva, Gilad. Uses of Nostalgia in Musical Politicization of Homophobic Myths in With a World Mine, The Big Gay Musical, and Zero Patience. In Padva, Gilad, Queer Nostalgia in Cinema and Pop Culture, pages 139-172. Basingstoke, UK and New York, Palgrave Macmillan, 2014. ISBN 978-1-137-26633-0.